Verse 1, chapter 12. Michael shall stand up. What is that time? That time right now was, already given to us from about 36 to the conclusion in 45. Antichrist is on the scene. That was our intersection of time events. 1, Antiochus Epiphanes, up to 36 to the close of 45, Antichrist. So that was the link on that timeline. With that in mind, this is what it is about. It's him. And it's also more greatly about God and what he will do. And that's take over sovereignly one who has exalted himself publicly to be as God. So Michael stands up in that time. And what happens? There is an assault on the world system, the spiritual system, the commercial system, and the assault means that it's coming by persuasive language, seductive language to bring everybody into a global community. The assault, though, will be purposed when we use that, this standing up, when Antichrist moves against Israel. So when we look at Michael, that name is being established because he is the guardian angel over Israel. We have no idea who our guardian angels are. Never been cited. Could it be that those who bless Israel become sharers of a guardian angel that has been noted? If nations have distinct guardian angels to counter the deceptive and wicked work of demonic entities that preside in high places over nations, could a nation be blessed with the strength of the angel Michael in suppressing wickedness? Something to consider. It was a promise that God gave Abraham: for those who bless you, I'm going to bless, and for those who curse you, I'm going to curse. And so though we have not yet seen it from the time that Israel has become a nation, but we do see it in terms of the strength that they've had, our engagements with them have never been in similitude of battles. They never joined us in Vietnam, never joined us in Iraq, never joined us in Afghanistan, never joined us in what was before that crisis, which was our full commitment. But the war that President Bush I waged, it was a smashing success. It was technically a war won within a week's time, going against Iraq. That was the Persian Gulf War, if you heard about it. But Israel wasn't there with us on that. But we are with them through everything that they've been through. The technology and the armament that we've been able to supply, as well as some of the Middle Eastern countries neighboring them, which is interesting. It is interesting that we've also brokered military equipment to what were at one time their adversaries. But what I'm saying is, Israel stays really compressed. Israel really stays about their own business, while at the same time, the contributions that they've made, both militarily, Iron Dome is still one of those head scratchers to most people. How is it that nations right next door that ought to just rain down fire and brimstone and obliterate Israel, it just doesn't work? Our rockets are shot out of the sky before, right after launch. And that was the technology that we supported financially, but actually was the brainchild of Israel. So is Michael even necessary? Yes, Michael is necessary, because we're talking about spiritual warfare compared to mechanical warfare, okay? So as Michael is introduced right now, it leads us to understand that this is going to be a ferocious war that connects heaven without any apology to ultimately the rebellious activities of mankind down below, and ultimately their hatred for this land and God's people. That's what this is all bringing us to. The great prince, and it says, who stands watch over the sons of your people. That's what he does. So even as he guards the nation, he apparently as well has an acute eye on the individuals of that nation. I think a great point to be made would be, how did Esther find herself in such a persuasive and historical contribution to the welfare of the Jews? She was one. And God used her intellect and spirit and beauty to have a camaraderie with a notable and powerful king. So God uses particular people, both men, sons, and women, daughters, in bringing out revelation of who he is and that nobody's going to get ahead of his plan. Then it says, before we close on verse 1, there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. So the interesting thing there is the reference of nation. Is it implying what Daniel would not have been able to know, 1948, May 14th? Or is it implying from the time that Abraham took up basically his staff and exercised his faith? And my belief is that it points to that. We can go to that point because that's the first part in chapter 12, which I think is neat because this is chapter 12 we're in right now. And from God's perspective, he was going to make Israel a nation through Abraham. Stars that could not be counted, sand that could not be calculated. And it was all going to be on this expressed work of faith, God honoring what's called the Abrahamic covenant. And that uniquely right now is being, in my opinion, bolstered here. But this time of trouble will be unlike anything that has ever been recorded in the annals of human history. So let's take a look at what that implies when we see that never since was a nation exposed to that, even to that time. And at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. So two things are mentioned right now. That though it looks ominous and impossible to escape, they have the promise of God that they shall. They're going to be delivered. When we talk about deliverance, it's available to any who what? Believe. The Jews, as a people group, are as accountable to believe in the Lord as we, coming from a Gentile, biblically background, as any. We're Christians. The Lord didn't come to honor expressions of different faiths that seem to be pointing to a supernatural God that seems to have a link to a teacher, prophet, rabbi named Jesus, who is still curiously trying to be explained as to what happened to any man that has ever been pointed to as a spiritual leader, because he is God, came as the Son of God, ascended to heaven to be at the right hand of his Father on the throne of power, unique and unlike any who has ever been pointed to, whether it's an inanimate object or whether it is an object of a man that in power given to him for a season proclaims himself to be something so special he needs to be worshipped. That's what ultimately Rome had the challenge with, that they allowed simply an office of an individual who was in governance to become exalted to the place of a god. That was the challenge that was posed to Jesus by the Pharisees, flipping them a coin. Let me see the coin. He looked at it and said, render then to Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God's what is God's. Don't try to entrap me. And they marveled at his ability to, with wisdom, cut right to the matter of the truth. We have institutions, honor the institutions, but there is a God. You're looking at him. Render to your God what is God's. Pretty cool in how he handled that. So, as this continues to be laid out right now, the emphasis is everyone who is found written in the book. The Jews believed in the book of life. What needed to come into their heart, though, was the fact that recording and having their names blotted from the book of life. You remember that even Moses, in a passionate moment, said, God, blot my name out. I mean, if you're not going to take us through, then blot my name out. Because all of the lands that we have passed through, and ultimately Egypt, whom you decimated, will have a laughing point if you can't get us to the end game. So they did believe in what would be called the eternity of the soul. But God was showing them through the Judaic system of worship that it had a requirement in order to appease a holy God that man had violated by sin. So the reason that this is being brought to our attention is because the Jews will be accountable, all of them, in having a vested faith in Jesus. Now some may say, well then, do they lose their Judaism? They lose the means by which everything symbolically pointed to God. They no longer exercise that. Well then who do they become? Less of a Jew, something different than a Jew? They remain a Jew. That's their heritage. That's their spiritual lifeline. But what they become is a member of a family that Jesus would say is my bride, Christians. So everybody that has a resurrection, and they will have two options. A resurrection unto life with God, a resurrection unto death, separated from God. It's eternal. There's no parties going on when the way parts for that decision to have been made and it wasn't made. And that's one of the hardest things to convey, because that's a lie that Satan plants in the minds of the ignorant and the arrogant. Hell's going to be such a party, you will not believe it. And they will believe it if that ultimately becomes their destination. So this point's important because Revelation cinches things up on ultimately what has to be done. Meaning, a decision has to be made. Meaning that in this time coming up, for Daniel, like his life is fading, so he knows with certainty he's connected with God, he's faithfully ministered God's message, but many, it says in verse 2, of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. In Daniel foretelling this, it means that the plan of salvation ultimately is hidden in this text. In other words, Daniel's not simply seeing that, oh, there's an everlasting life, but he's actually seeing revealed here there's a consequence concerning that life not lived for God. Shame and everlasting contempt. The wrath of God abides on him who is not abiding in his Son. It's suspended in this dispensation of grace, meaning that though it abides on an individual separated from God because of no relationship with Jesus, a person is not experiencing the weight of that rejection. They will. Right now, that weight of rejection was imposed upon the Son of God. The weight of rejection right now in ignoring that decision will, at the time of a person's life, be fully met out in a crushing weight of judgment that will no longer be suspended. That's what this means. The other implication is this. There's a time, because we've already seen the picture, Antiochus Epiphanes, Antichrist, in which in that dominion, that rule, which is going to be vicious, unlike anything that's ever happened, death will occur. And this will be death by demise. In other words, it's not just people passing away by old age. They're actually going to be murdered. Part of the suggestion here that you'd find later on in Revelation is that if this event has never been equaled before this nation was founded in God's eyes, that means it makes what we have said historically to be the worst time in the whole nation, which would be persecution under Hitler. It makes that look like child's play. That's how vicious this will be. I don't know the populace of the Jewish nation right now, but we do know that by fact there was no less than 6 million to 8 million Jews that were basically annihilated heinously. So we've already talked about that. We don't need to dive back to it. But right now, this message is saying not even a comparison. And part of that is that where Hitler was the source of vile intimidation and ultimately execution, in the tribulation period, though Jews will come out of it, not all of them are going to escape the wrath of God coming down upon a what? Christ-rejecting world. So there's going to be something that happens with regard to inclusiveness in the suffering. Part of it's going to happen on the social and political scene, meaning they will have a worldwide rejection in every area that they meaningfully have been elevated to. They're going to be a despised people group again. When in prophecy it says that Jerusalem becomes a cup of trembling, it literally means that the cup is going to be shaking because of the hatred that is poured out upon the Jewish people. So they're going to, in essence, be scattered again, but they'll be caught. There will be escape, but there will be capture. And there's going to be imprisonment, there's going to be torture, there's going to be brutality, there's going to be loss of life. That's what we know. When we see these foreshadows of both what Antiochus Epiphanes did, what ultimately down the road Hitler has done, no comparison to what Antichrist will do. And that's where it's going to happen right now, when there's going to be a season in which Daniel gives us a clue. He didn't understand it, but we have a clue as to how that's going to happen. But it says, those who are wise, and by the way, Jesus will say this to the church, in essence, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit has to say. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So encapsulated in this is the hope of the evangel, the message of salvation. So all it takes is for an individual, man, woman, child, in these days to speak the word of salvation. And that means when you see the movies like Left Behind, has anybody seen the Left Behind series? By the way, did you know I went to school with one of those actors? Brad Johnson, the airline pilot.
I don't know who Cameron is. What are you Cameron?
What was his name? Steele?
Kirk Cameron, that's what it was.
No. Cameron?
No, the pilot.
The pilot.
Ray? Ray.
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 He was 2 grades below me.
Really?
Yeah,
That's awesome.
thank you.
You are so cool.
Well, I choose to think that I was a motivating factor in this movie. They just missed on which one they wanted to choose. I had to yield. There you go. No, he was a very cool guy. But I never would have seen that. So anyway, just you can journal that, write it down.
Put that on your notes.
That's right. Put that in your notes. So verses 1 through 3 is setting up right now through Daniel acknowledging the presence of Michael and the difficulties of the times, and ultimately the hope yet is still to come. In lieu of all of this, there's this shining light. Verse 4, but you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. It has been looked at as setting, if you would, a parameter as to, so how are we going to know? And the running to and fro could be the busyness, quite different than in his day, but literally the busyness of people in doing a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with God. Could indicate that. Could be indicative of a means or form of transport that was never available to them. What do we do now? We fly. And we get in fast ships. And we get in fast cars. We're looking at always trying to go faster and do it better, more efficiently. Flying cars are being developed. Your generation could. It may be happening, but you know that the technology has been pursuing the ability for cars to literally take off from your driveway and fly to work and land. And we've already seen that some things have shown us that. These little mini airplanes, well, they're trying to do that with automobiles. They have already perfected the jetpack. Have you seen that ever? I saw when the first jetpack was invented in about 1966 as a little kid. And it launched from a football field at a high school that I was watching my brothers play football in. And so this guy in a white space outfit with a helmet, all of a sudden he hits these thruster rockets and this thing just goes, and he's flying all around the football field, and he lands. He doesn't die. Some people have died trying to fly them. So the implication could be that in the future there is going to be rapid transit that happens that cues us in. We have the Concorde that can make it from New York to France in half the time. So if it was a 14-hour flight or 16, I don't remember what it was, everything was compressed to be half or even faster than that. They stopped the Concorde as an airline when one of them caught fire and blew up. I think it killed everybody on board. It was a funny looking jet, really streamlined, and it had almost like it had almost like a bend to it. But it was a supersonic means of travel. Because of that one incident, they decided it wasn't worth it. The cost also to fly it. But a lot of the stars, the big Hollywood and entertainment stars were using it because they would get so tired doing transatlantic flights. They want to just get there, be done, and get back. So they paid a lot of money to do it. But that being said, is that what are we all doing now? The moon doesn't satisfy us anymore. We want to go to Mars. I'm going, do you have any idea what you're thinking about? Really? Being trapped? I mean, think about it. If we crammed this entire class into our Suburban and said, we're just going to drive until we get somewhere, but until we get somewhere, you're going to be possibly just needing to get comfortable where you're at. None of us would volunteer for that. And so when you talk about in my opinion, stupidity of people saying, how cool would that be to go to Mars? There's no life on Mars. You want to be in a big giant diaper the rest of your life with a helmet on? It just doesn't make sense. Well, come on, it's a spacesuit. You can't get out of it. It's there. And I'm just going, that doesn't just sound fun to me at all. Spending a majority of your life floating through the blackness of space with the real possibility that your oxygen tank may be turned off by somebody you ticked off the day before. What are they going to do? But that indicates possibly right now, it does indicate that possibly people are going to be so massively busy, just massively busy. And it could indicate also what we know to be the information age or the internet age, in which everything in knowledge is being communicated in split seconds. The access of both busyness and also knowledge that is coming, it shall increase. But this is an important point. I think it's a valid one. It doesn't say anything about wisdom, it just says knowledge. But if wisdom is not married to knowledge, it becomes stupid and at times irrelevant. God's first appeal is that we're wise. Wisdom cries out in the streets because anybody can hand you knowledge that's intriguing and seductive and carnal, and what do you do with it? We now are given a location. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood two others, one on this riverbank and the other on that riverbank. Remember, he's seeing this. We're not sure of what riverbanks there are, but we know that in the Babylonian area, the Fertile Crescent, the two major rivers would have been the Euphrates and the Tigris. We know that those were the two major rivers. And they weren't neighboring rivers, meaning this must be an awesome projection right now, again, that Daniel is seeing. So it gives us kind of a hub, a point of what would be known as the cradle of civilization. Meaning that very likely within this area, there's a connection that God's making that drives us back to the Garden of Eden, when things were perfect. And man did have uninterrupted fellowship with God. And though we can't find it, even though we have coordinates such as at least rivers, there's the Gihon, we don't know exactly what happened to that, Tigris, Euphrates, Gihon. There was a fourth. There was actually a single river that split in fives, and that's the name of them. Pishon was the other. And so God may be driving even Daniel back to sentiment as to where he's at, where really all of us want to be. I want to return to the garden, which again I think is one of the fascinations we have of going to beautiful places, not necessarily desert places, but beautiful places. I don't believe the Garden of Eden would have experienced what we have come to appreciate, which would be the desert climates. I think it would have been extraordinarily tropical, beautifully indulgent, completely satisfying, and to be there with the presence of God. So the contrast right now is saying that's That was then, this is now. But these guys right now presiding over these two major rivers, which could be indicative too of a flow that's inevitably of God, a flow of judgment and a flow of blessings that is inevitably of God. And so this is all very mysterious, it's pictured, but one on one side, one on the other. But notice this, one said to the man clothed in linen, and that has not yet been revealed, one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fullness or fulfillment of these wonders be? And then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. So this is, again, another extraordinary piece of information. There seems to be one center where the two, I'm going to say, angelic majesties are presiding over the rivers. And one who is over the river, who has his hands up, in my opinion, has what would be called the qualifiers of being a Christophany. Jesus himself over the central area of the rivers that these angels are on. And much as we've seen him do when the feeding of the 4,000, feeding of the 5,000, he holds up the food and asks his Father to bless this food. And so this could be that kind of a picture. And I wouldn't doubt that that would be important to see, because in it, when we look at the next detail that comes up, it is information that we've already decoded. And that would be that when the time is near, it's going to be for a time, times, and a half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, who are the holy people? That would be the nation of Israel, right? Leviticus tells us of a holy God, holy priesthood, holy people, a holy land, a holy Savior. Okay, that's what Leviticus boils down to. And within the holy people is the conduct of the people towards God and among one another's. All of those things that deal with a personal discipline of walking with the Lord without conflict of unrighteousness. So when you see that it's time, times, and a half time, that has been figured out to mean, for instance, the time is 1 year, times is 2 year, and the half is simply that, half. So if you have 1 time, times 2, not multiplication, but times equals 2, and the half, that equals 1/2, that's 3.5 years. So we've talked about, but isn't the tribulation a 7-year period? And the answer is yes. The reason that that's important is because when in the previous studies of Daniel, we were talking about what time needs then to be completed. It's the last 7 years. The last 7 years on the time clock of God fulfilling this happens when Antichrist makes his appearance. He makes his appearance when the church is taken up. We went to Revelation 4 on that. Come up here, that's the rapture, and then Antichrist on the scene moves to encapsulate, solidify his power, set up his positions of strength globally. 3.5 years, and then at that time, the wonders that are being presented right now literally is the wrath. Remember that the terminology that God used to talk to Moses is that Pharaoh's heart would be hardened by the wonders of a divine judgment upon them. We look at it and go, hailstones, that's a wonder? Yeah, it was a wonder, but it also provoked, wonder what's happening here. I've never seen snowballs like that before. Frogs? Ew, man, what are we doing those guys? You know, everything that happened in what were called the plagues upon Egypt from God through Moses, it was a wonder. Nobody had ever seen it before. Trying to kick off locusts from your pancakes and finding them in your pots. I thought we were having beef tonight. When did locusts become a part of the menu? You know, everything that was happening to them had never happened to them before. They go to get a drink of water and the tap spills out blood. And so that wonder, though, at that time, we would say was an imposing judgment to clarify who God was and who God wasn't. God was not Pharaoh. God was superior to Pharaoh. God had put Pharaoh in position. You kind of ask yourself, how could he have not gotten that wonder to be addressed by putting himself on his knees saying, I don't want any more of this. But it shows you the hardness of men's heart. So that being said, is that wonder goes back to sighting with Moses. And this wonder is going to be the provocation of people literally saying, I wonder what's happening. I'm not trying to say that word means that. I'm saying there's going to be so much intense supernatural work from God that it's going to be a provocation, and it will be having never been experienced before, and it's going to be happening seemingly at a time simultaneously that the Antichrist is going to be doing his hardness of heart thing. And ultimately, what is his goal? His goal is to completely shatter the holy people, their power. They are powerful. They're powerfully spiritual. But God will break them. He's going to break Antichrist. Neither of those two will have dominion over God's sovereignty. But the Jewish people will be brought to nothing and yet saved from everything. Meaning this, they're not going to be obliterated by the evil intentions of Antichrist. God will save them, but it is called, notably, the remnant. Does the entire Jewish nation as unbelievers get saved? No, the nation gets saved. But remember, God would have looked at Abraham, Moses, Joshua, David. He would have said, nation. You're a nation. So, though we don't know how many, we know that if God is going to, and he'll show us in Revelation, probably won't get there, but if he's going to use 144,000 evangelists that are Jews, but believers, see, they're not just going to be Jewish men who are theologically astute. They're going to be spirit-filled Jews, literally, indistinguishable from their people, except they've got a message different than their people about Messiah. They're going to be powerfully used. Each one of them will be equipped in such a way that the hearts of those they teach and lay hands on will be changed. Eyes are going to be opened. Hearts that at one time Jeremiah would say need to be written on by a diamond stylus will be able to have just the touch of the finger of God that turns them into an altogether different person. There'll be radical salvation that's going on. Not only that, but as those people are being saved, the Gentile communities that were left behind, that are picking up remnants of our Bibles and our notes, they're going to be selling themselves out, not to Antichrist, but to God. Revelation tells us as well that there's going to be the dispatch of angels, at least 3, that will be moving in the atmosphere, pronouncing the message of salvation. So talk about that. What does that look like? Are they going to look like butterflies? Are they going to be streaking through the heavens like a missile? Misunderstood for being a missile? It indicates that their voicing will be distinctly heard and they will be distinctly seen. That's a wonder. That's a provocation. So it's interesting right now because ultimately those who still have time to believe and need to believe will do so after having decimation happened in their life. Their communities, their homes, their businesses, it will be as what World War II represents to us historically, but even worse. Because remember what is happening on the scene. The mark of the beast will have to have been either accepted or rejected. Rejection leads to death. Imprisonment, at the least, death with certainty. And we don't even know how that figures out. But we know that a lot of people are going, not so big. How are they doing that? Because we've all got chips in our car. We've got chips on our license plates. We've got chips being embedded in our animals. A chip is a chip. I prefer a Frito, but, you know. But it's becoming right now where it's no big deal. So could you have a chip put into your body for purposes of identification to make clearance going through an airport much faster where you're not seen as a terrorist? all of your stats could be red, we're not trying to pull out ID and anything, and just boop. Now, we know that distinctly this was an embedding of a number that should be on the forehead, but they can do that. They've shown that embedding of identification in the scantest, what you'd call the minutest element is successfully holding information about you on the person. So it would be definitely the forehead that you would be asking yourselves, I don't think I want that. But it's interesting too, because guess what's becoming popular these days? Tattooing. And inks are becoming very specialized right now. They're literally coming up with inks that have a metallic infusion in them. And metal is one of the things that is used to transfer data. So it could be something that we will see all of a sudden, isn't this a cool tattoo? And go, that's a 666. I know, it's the in number. It's in. And look at the gold. And isn't this awesome? And we go, not really. I mean, we wouldn't say that, but those who are down, see, that's the thing, is that everything is actually, you can have this side, you can have that way. We got tattoo parlors right down the block. Ooh, we're good right now with copper and gold infusions. You'll love it. Silver's awesome this month. It's one of our best sellers. Can I have my 666 in Hebrew just to make it a little bit? Oh, of course. Your language, your number. Absolutely, but it means the same. So all of these ploys could be happening. We see it in what we call Aramaic numerals, but we've got a lot of nations and they don't use Aramaic numbering. They use a lot of other things. And as well, there's the equating of letters that equal numbers. That could be a form of also identification. Well, all of a sudden tattooing becomes vogue, not realizing that, whoa, what did I just do? And you're trying to scrub it off, it's not going to scrub off. Commitment decision's been made. So that being said, is that there seems to be right now everything pointing to God presiding over the rivers that two angelic beings are positioning themselves over, indicating again this dynamic work, divinely orchestrated and protecting ultimately the plan of God to take on Antichrist. So time times and a half, 1 year plus 2 years plus a half, 3.5 years, 3.5 years of what you'd call a contract of peace and of establishing the administrative power force of Antichrist. Everything's going along well. The believers have been explained out of the universe. We were just meditated out of the universe. God got those jerks, didn't he? Antichrist will be able to explain all of that. He'll be able to explain open tombs that no longer hold bodies. All of that will be explained. And probably it'll go, isn't this great? Now we can put up some awesome condos and they'll be free. Free! And so the seduction of the people. But isn't it interesting, because when you go around here, we see when we go to our country, what can we honestly take some boasting points in? Our cemeteries, by and large, are very beautiful. They're laid out beautifully. You come to Israel, and I don't think any of us have been necessarily impressed with those on top sarcophaguses, right? It kind of looks like a junkyard of bodies, doesn't it? I'm not saying this to condemn their style. What I'm saying is God's making more of an overt statement in his holy land concerning the end time than we. We look at a graveyard and we go, oh, the sentiment. We look at a graveyard and we go, peace. That is a wonderful place. We look at it and it's so groomed and manicured. The Jews look at a graveyard and they have to see this, honestly, the sobriety. That's where my bones are going to be packed one day. I don't like the way it looks. It doesn't look very accommodating. They're actually hit with a stronger reality of death than we are. We have a comforting reality. Flowers, the beautiful flowers. I've seen sunflowers placed on, but not a lot. So it's a whole different contrast right now that Israel faces. God's really having an in-your-face moment. Do you see these stones? These are very similar, that at one time I had rolled in front of the tomb that secured my son, God would say. Now they're cut in chunks of squares and rectangles, and they represent a covering that only my son will be able to break you out of, period. no other way. They live in the hope that there is a resurrection, but they live hopelessly, not realizing that it's linked totally to Jesus. So the men right now, clothed in linen, above the waters, one on the left, one on the right of the rivers, the holy people completely shattered. That's the important part. This represents the end times. That represents the moment in which by their decimation they will cry out to the Lord. They'll be completely broken. And God in that moment, when they say that, will come in and gather them again. Petra becomes in play, though we're not going to see it here. It's more alluded to in the Revelation. And so in this, although I heard, I did not understand. Then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? So he's addressing that singularly, not plurally, meaning he's not talking to the three. He's talking to the central figure of this vision, Jesus. Very likely. Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. The time of the end was given. Times and a half. 3.5 years. When 3.5 years hits, in essence, that's the close of the 7 years remaining for God to do his work. There will be another number coming up. We'll get there. Many shall be purified, made white and refined. This speaks of conversion. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So conversion, while at the same time contempt. Conversion for some, contempt by a majority. Contempt leads to contention, warfare. Verse 11, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there should be 1,290 days. So this moves us back into separating the days and finding out what does that equal. So it's going to equal approximately the latter half of the 3.5 years that equal the 7 total years. That's essentially here. But there is a number change, and I want to kind of address that before we close. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,345 days. I'm just going to share this enough to simply say that most of this is based on a lunar calendar. There's mathematics that suggest when the Jewish lunar calendar is done the way which this is decoded, there's some pluses and minuses that need to be put in place. But as you can see, there's a difference of about 45 days between these two numbers. The 45 days has been suggested by theologians, astute commentators, the scholars of end times prophecy, as the time that the Lord will allow when he comes in to vanquish with the church the work of Antichrist. He'll allow 45 days in which the evidence of that desecration will remain before the cleaning out of the temple. Why would he do that? Again, this is just a suggestion, but I think it has merit. In the Nuremberg trials back in World War II, presided over by a military court, and overseeing it ultimately in distributing punishments to the criminal echelon of the Nazi regime. Hitler had already taken his life, so he was out of it. But at least 4 of the most significant generals under Hitler were judged by a world panel, military tribunal, and determined worthy of execution. And most of them were hung. One took his life with a cyanide pill before execution. But the point I'm making there is that as these last days are being presented, when Germany, which had ignored the heinous crimes that had been committed against the Jews, they smelled the crematoriums, they saw the dark clouds that were hovering over their mountains, they were having it explained away. They were justifying the mass slayings of babies and mothers and husbands and grandparents. All of that was being explained away. And what happened is that they had to, literally at the close of the war, the entire communities that were within stone's throw of Auschwitz and the other, what were called concentration camps, Tribeca, all of those communities had to be marched through them, where the bodies were stacked up, heaped up to 9 and 10 feet, rotting. The graves, mass graves that had been dug in which bodies had been poured into it, ashes still remaining and body parts still remaining in the crematorium. It was determined that any community within literally a stone's throw from that would be marched through it to see soberingly what they had allowed to have happen without addressing it. And so that's called basically bystander apathy. It was a social work that was done in New York City many years ago, not as far back as World War II, but it's called basically bystander apathy, in which you choose to do nothing though you're aware of something terrible happening. And it happened when a young woman coming home from a shift change into her New York apartment was accosted and basically murdered. And it was determined that over 100 people not only were aware of it, they saw the crime and the individual, they chose not to report it, nor to say anything. It became then a federal crime to ignore that kind of an incident without reporting or making some effort to save somebody. So by the way, anytime there's something that happens like that, federally you are expected to intercede. Whether it's to throw a rock, whether it's to scream, whether it's to get on your cell phone, whether it's to throw yourself in the mix and take that person on to save an innocent life. That is the expectation of law based on this principle that we have a tendency to hide from truth and don't want to get messed up in it. So this 45 days that I'm talking about that concludes this chapter right now may be that Jesus allows that to stand as a mark of the willful disobedience and the heinous criminality of Antichrist and his spiritual depravity. He will already have been judged. But the Lord may tolerate, before he conclusively comes in and does a makeover, people having to literally that come out of that experience to go by and to see what had been done to defile the temple, his temple, to give them a sobering look on what is happening, what is going to happen. At the close of this, well, we see it, but in Revelation, it is called for 1,000 years, the millennium period, enforced righteousness. That means this: we're going to be serving a God who knows with precision what righteousness is. It would seem to be with Satan being chained for 1,000 years, the persuasion to the carnal mind, which we will be governing. We're going to be governing people who are human. We are altogether different. We're divine beings with human characteristics. But our behavior will not be subject to corruption. Those who are on earth will have a potential of corruption. And so they'll need us to give them correction. Oh, you left your gum wrapper out on the sidewalk. No littering. Sorry about that. We don't exactly know what it means. You smoke in somebody's, shawarma. I'm going to pray for you again. Disease spreading. We don't know what it means, so I'm trying to be humorous saying we don't know what it means. But we are going to be presiding with Jesus at a time in which the human element will be there. With the human element are all the things that you can imagine. Okay? Babies are going to be born, marriages will be happening to the human element. There's going to be a populace that will arise. And at the end of 1,000 years, Satan will be released to test man one more time. He'll be put down. But there will be, as hard as it is to believe this, who in the presence of the Lord will turn their back on God consciously to follow the seductive wooings of Satan. That decision will cost them eternity. So that wraps up Daniel's vision right now. Go your way till the end, for you shall rest. This is God's saying. You've made it, old timer. You get to rest now. You get to rest. And will arise. And notice this is the promise of Daniel. He gets to rest. Okay? But it says, and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. So we know that he would have been comforted in Abraham's bosom, but we also know that Jesus went and collected the Old Testament saints through Ephesians and through 1 Peter. Is it not he who ascended into heaven also descended into the lower portions of the earth and brought into captivity those who were held captive, and basically took them into heaven because he was the first fruit of the dead. So I think it's an exciting closure. Lord, we ask for your blessings that as we have endeavored to be diligent and studious, we're obviously not unfamiliar with Daniel, but we did dive into it for a new washing and a perspective. And so we pray that this is encouraging to us, because it is meant, especially in this last chapter, to tell us that you're going to sum things up and with precision. You've even got the days numbered. There's no way that any of us should be caught off guard, nor any of our family members and friends. It's that precise. We can cite so many things now that Daniel would have been unaware of then, and we can anchor it then with a faith that still needs to be expressed in believing. So thank you for the revelation of your word and your spirit, and in Jesus' name we pray, amen.